Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
And welcome everybody to this Presence episode on spirituality and science. I'm excited for this series that we're going to be doing. And I'm especially excited that a major part of this series is going to be with my good friend Joe Masterleo, who is the author of The Ambient Christ. Joe, so glad to be doing these episodes with you. Welcome to the Presence Forum here.
Well, it's good to be a part of this, and it's good to be a part of piecing the various dimensions to integral theology together. It's a privilege. Thank you.
Oh, our pleasure, Joe. As a matter of fact, we had an opportunity to get to know you and Ruth in the era we call BC, before COVID.
Yes.
So we got to spend a few days with you all here. You and I had some great discussions while you were in the process of writing this book, and I was so intrigued by it. And having thoroughly read and studied the book, it was everything I had hoped it would be. So again, I appreciate you being here to share it with us.
Oh, you're most welcome.
So I guess obviously I'd like for people to know about your background, because it's very similar to so many people that are writing in the integral space as far as how do people get here. They usually don't come through traditional means. So maybe you can give us a little background about what you do vocationally and then how you got to write on science and spirituality.
Okay, well, my background is in the mental health care field and the behavioral sciences.
Mm-hmm.
I go back in terms of my experience, about 5 decades or so. That sounds like a long time when you say it.
Yep.
But I did started out in inpatient services. I worked as a therapy aide for a number of years, and went back and got my degrees, my undergraduate and graduate degrees, and my professional degree and license is in clinical social work. And it entitles me to practice privately. I've had a private practice now working with individuals, couples, and families for about 37 years, and on my own. And somewhere back, maybe 35, maybe 40 years ago, I had a spiritual experience and awakening, showing an interest in the scriptures seriously for the first time in my late 20s, early 30s, and became awakened to that dimension. And was sort of curious from that point forward as to how to make sense of things psychological and things spiritual. Was there an interface there? Was there a room to integrate both?
Yes.
And since I was new to things spiritual and theological, it took a while for me to get grounded in the ABCs of scripture and spiritual foundations in the Christian tradition.
Sure.
And then I was able to sort of put the two together and see that, there are psycho-spiritual realities that people need to integrate themselves, their person with their spiritual dimension. And it sort of became clear to me, and I think it was part of the gifting I had, because I was clinically trained long before, I had an active spiritual life or an active faith piece. So over time, it seemed like I was able to put the two together, and in a way that I was called to put the two together.
And so how in the world does a guy who's in that field end up writing a book that has great depth with regard to these science models and science applications? How do you make that jump?
Well, I was about to say, my work involves working with people's narratives.
Yeah.
Everybody who comes to see me has a story. We all have stories. We all have lives. We all have histories.
Yes.
And those stories have themes and patterns in them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm used to thinking in terms of, in their individual lives and their family and relationship lives. And I'm used to thinking in terms of picking out those themes and patterns, particularly the troublesome ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then having a sense of how, and using my skills and resources to help them overcome those, work through those if that's the case, heal from those if there's wounding.
Mm-hmm.
So the kind of thinking involved in clinical work has you juggling multiple variables within people, between people,
Mm-hmm.
among people if you're working with a family or a group. And so one is used to being trained and used to thinking in terms of the big picture. And so to answer your question more directly, I became aware as I became a bit more spiritually mature. I began to wonder if, as I solved the mystery of how I believe the behavioral sciences fits in with spiritual realities, how they can be integrated, I began to think in larger wholes. How might science or the things that we know about science, because there have been great developments in science in the last 20, 30, 40 years even.
Yeah.
And in most fields, we live in the age of information. So in most fields, there's, we know more than we can understand.
Exactly.
There's a glut of information out there. So I just began to toy with the idea of what the common elements might be between the discoveries of science or what science knows, particularly, the area of quantum physics, the part of physics that studies the infinitely invisible things,
Mm-hmm.
and spirituality. So it came out of that type of curiosity.
Yeah.
And I began to wonder if there are common elements in what the scriptures reveal and talk about and what science talks about in terms of, a unitive field,
Sure.
a unitive field of forces,
Mm-hmm.
because spiritualities around the world know that God is one,
Mm-hmm.
and that all things are one in God,
Mm-hmm.
especially their mystical traditions.
Yes.
And, I became aware that quantum physics basically talks about an invisible plane of existence, an extrasensory place of existence out of which all things, there's a unity out of which multiplicity comes in creation. So it sounded very much alike.
Absolutely. There's a
So,
lot of similarities there, obviously, with the theological approach where we come from. This idea of an integral consciousness. This is something that has just appeared on the planet in the last handful of decades. So it's an amazing thing to see what's happening in all these fields, whether it's theology, science, spirituality, etc., east, west. This is another thing. There's, bridge building that you and I are both seeing between east and west now. So unity consciousness relates very much, obviously, to a universe. So you've pulled that together beautifully.
Yeah, and at the same time, I became aware of the notion, currently, over the last 15, 20 years maybe, particularly the last 10, where the thinking envelope of the planet, in pockets, folks are there's a movement toward, synthesizing and looking for commonalities in all fields of knowledge.
Yes.
And I sort of feel like the work you're doing and the interest I have is a part of that thinking envelope. It gives expression to itself when the time is right, everywhere, not just in one or two places. And so I feel like I'm a very small part of what other people like yourself are wrestling with around the globe.
Yeah, we're all a small part, but that's what's fun. Everybody gets a part.
Yeah.
Everybody gets a journey. Everyone has their own unique investigation of what it means to exist. And so that's what we're doing. And actually, that word synthesis, I'll read some quotes here from your book. One of the quotes that you've got is that it's now time for a new story, the synthesis of two stories, creation and evolution.
Yes.
So anything you'd like to comment on there as far as synthesizing creation, evolution, bring, that two-story element into a unified story?
Well, that's what piqued my curiosity, because we seem to be, as a planet, certainly in the Christian tradition, we seem to be between stories.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of different stories, that floating around in theories in science, and of course we know the scriptures has a creation story, a consummation story, multiple stories in between. I mean, we're people of story.
Mm-hmm.
Story gives us meaning.
Yes.
Story gives us direction.
Yes.
Story gives us values. Story gives us identity.
Mm-hmm. Story
gives us inspiration. We watch movies all the time because the movie industry knows that we like stories, and we like to identify with characters and stories. And so it seems like we have to oversimplify a bit, we have the creation story, and then we have the evolution story.
Yeah.
We have, the stories or the narratives of science. And so I began to wonder, are there any universal common elements that, say between, and I'm most familiar with the Judeo-Christian scriptures, so that was my platform.
Right.
What do I see in scripture that kind of stands out at me that I also see in science that might help me identify a common universal element that joins all things?
Yes.
And that's where the direction my thoughts began to go. And it seemed like as I was pursuing that, again, someone who's used to looking for themes and patterns, it seemed to me that I could see one clearly, and like pieces of a puzzle, how they were falling together. And I don't want to take all the credit for that. I mean, I'm the instrument that was monkeying around with that in my thoughts, but it also felt like something was urging me to do that based on my own narrative. So.
Absolutely. And of course, we're the same as you in presence. You start with a narrative, and then you expand that in your investigation of other narratives, looking for commonality, looking for ways that narratives integrate. And we focus, of course, like you had mentioned, on the biblical narrative. And so that's our foundation. But the biblical narrative points away from itself to any narrative that's talking about what the biblical narrative calls God, or the first cause, if we're talking philosophically or scientifically, etc. And then that allows us to build bridges, like you said, with other narratives, which are also doing the same thing we're all doing, and that is trying to figure out how there was an ultimacy that existed, and from that came all the things we understand in our existence. So that again is a place where we would tie directly in with what you're saying there.
Yeah, well, I looked at the creation story, and evolution, and the biblical narrative is an evolving one in terms of how God manifests himself in history.
Yeah.
Okay. I looked at it, at those two stories as meridians, like meridians on a globe. They're they don't intersect, they're parallel. Because science is more on the empirical side, that which you can measure and weigh. And of course, the creation story, involves faith. Later on, it involves the spiritual dimension, one awakening to that. But I saw them as meridians, but like on a globe, the meridians meet at the poles. Okay.
Yeah.
And I felt that God was the pole here, the pole star, the place out of which various subjects that we divide and separate in our mind, because that's the way the mind works, like biology, physics, chemistry, spirituality. They basically all have one source, and they're manifested in different forms, and and in various multiplicities that we experience as multiplicities, nature, biology. But there is no pure biology, pure chemistry, pure physics, pure spirituality. They all run together.
Yes.
They're not they're categorized that are convenient for us to study, but they don't exist in reality in separate boxes. They're one unified tapestry.
Yes.
So I was down that trail trying to figure out, okay, what, in physics that's known as the singularity.
Yes.
In spirituality, it's God. Okay. What is the source out of which all things come and to which they return? And, and what is their seamless connection? And particularly in the New Testament, I was fascinated. There are 3 places in Colossians 1:16 where, in reference to Christ, the verse declares, he in whom all things consist and are held together.
Yeah.
Well, my question was, well, what do they consist of? What is the substance of that consistence, and what holds them together?
Right.
Because that implies an organic connection between spirit or divinity and the created order. The second one is Colossians 2:10, where it says he fills all things. Okay. But what does he fill all things with? What's the essence of what he fills things with?
Yeah.
And the third one is, Christ is all and in all.
Yeah.
So that implies a powerful, seamless unity between the created order and divinity, a very imminent, which is what, Christ was giving clues when he was, they would ask him, he would talk about the kingdom of heaven, and they'd say, well, what are you talking about? Where is it? He said, it's within and all around you.
Yes.
Eyes to see and ears to hear. There's a line in the Gospel of Thomas where he's quoted as saying in that gospel, allegedly Thomas's gospel, it's said a little differently, but there's no contradiction. He's quoted as saying, Christ says, the kingdom of heaven is spread upon the face of the earth, and men do not see it. So there's an invisible or implicate order that's seamlessly connected to the visible or explicate order in a way that makes them a seamless garment. And that became clear to me as I studied the scriptures, was familiar with some other religions, and also some basic science.
Yeah. And, you're bringing up some really key points philosophically, I think, theologically, that are being borne out by science. And that is that whenever we now are able to observe ways in which we humans have segregated or separated things, it's kind of like a red light goes off. And we realize that separation, which in the biblical narrative is another term for death, that separation should get our attention, whether we're separated from each other with our denominated thinking, or whether we're separated from each other in ethnic or other types of ways. That should raise immediate alarms. And this is why the book that you've written and bringing science in is just more evidence that we humans are always in need and growing toward the understanding of the fact that we don't live in a silo. I don't live, even though COVID is telling us we have to be isolated, we're never isolated in that sense. And we know that when we are isolated, we're not too happy about it. So this is what's beautiful about this integral. It's the nature of nature.
Yes, it is. That as I like to say, looking at it with an integrated perspective, an integrated consciousness, or as a whole person, where left and right brain perceptually are working together in tandem. Mm-hmm. There is no division and separation. There is a unified field. Einstein, knew that there was a unified field in the cosmos in his particular discipline, which was physics. He knew there was. And he spent the last 30 years of his life trying to figure it out. Right up until a few hours before his death, as a matter of fact, he tried to, like he did his relativity theory, he tried defining it through mathematics and physics. And he couldn't do it, but he in his lifetime. But right. He was, and I believe quantum mechanics, though he had some understanding of it. It was in its infancy, I believe. He was very aware that, that part of physics, he dealt with the general relativity. Quantum physics is a different branch. But anyway, he was very well aware of that and tried to put the pieces together. I think the key to that is you can't look through any lens of any one discipline.
Right.
Because all of them lead to the unified ground. Yeah. All of multiplicity from all of the so-called silo disciplines lead to one trunk. So you kind of have to look through all of them and see the one thing they have in common. Yeah. And not get too close to anyone.
Yes.
And have that as your exclusive or narrow visual field, including theology.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why I say, we're really having what we would call a trans-narrative discussion, because all narratives point beyond themselves. The narrative is the finger. Right. And what the finger is supposed to do is point away, not to itself. It's not pointing to itself. And so this is the point of multi-narrative investigations. People, especially when they come out of religions have concretized and attached to a narrative in such a way that if you bring up anything outside the narrative, it creates real alarm. What are you saying? You're talking about things that are not in the Bible. Same as a fundamentalist scientist. If you say anything beyond what they have in their scientific narrative of the measurable, and you start moving out in the other direction, many scientists, not all, but many scientists become reductionist and reductionistic in that. So this is, again, what we're learning. And the point of it is that it brings us greater abundance. This idea of abundance that Jesus is talking about, I believe, is just this very thing. And that is, we human beings always have greater abundance ahead of us. And I think we've reached a place, a shift right now on the planet, where we're having unique conversations that absolutely weren't happening, 3 decades or so ago.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And
so, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, in terms of other quotes that I really liked, that emphasize what we've just talked about, you say that the importance of story is all about transporting and transformation. Well, transformation, as you know, Joe, is huge in our trajectory of form, transform, and formless. So we agree with you there. Awakening, igniting change in thought, perception, and behavior. This is in line with what we've just talked about. So that leads us to innovation. And this is what you and I are trying to do. We're trying to say, hey, what innovation can we have here? And that's looking at old stories and existing knowledge, like we do with the biblical narrative and the way it's been translated, interpreted through hermeneutics over the last couple thousand years. And how can we look at that with fresh, integral eyes? And that's what you're trying to do in the Ambient Christ.
Yes, because innovators are folks, by and large, I think the definition, there are several different definitions or facets to when innovation evolves, but basically an innovator is somebody who takes a look at things that already exist and reimagines and reconfigures how they might look if you look at them with fresh eyes. How they might better fit together, how they might tell a better story, how they might reveal something that in their separateness or characteristically thought as separate, like the scriptures and science. What that picture might look like if you find, if you're able to find a common element. And so, thinking in wholes or looking for themes and patterns, the dots, it became clear to me, and this is what inspired me to do the book, that the dots were there to connect, at least from my point of view. And I tried in the book to clearly present what those dots are that involve the common element and the way we can reconfigure things based on the facts, based on supportive evidence from science and scripture.
Yes.
I tried to tell a story which I believe was already there, but just kind of waiting to be unveiled.
That's exactly what we're saying. It's like in the biblical narrative, when we use spiral dynamics as a model, we already know that we've gone through the traditional age. And when you look through that traditional lens, you read the scripture and you have a certain way of interpreting it. Then we entered the modern age. Once again, when you look through the modern lens, you look at the same scripture, but now you're interpreting it and bringing in other facets or deconstructing old interpretations you had. And then you go to a postmodern, more inclusive lens, and you read the same data. You're reading the same content, meaning the same scripture, but in each of the cases, before people, fundamentalists are always are more likely to be alarmed at this, or people within Christianity who are afraid that this is going off into some new age. We're getting away from the Bible. We're getting away from scripture. We're not getting away. We are continuing to mature, grow, and see a greater depth into this story.
Absolutely. I go back to one of the verses I like to pivot on when people confront me with their doubts about, what I'm doing. And as I discuss with them, looking at something from a different angle, I go back to Matthew 13, where there's 7 or 8 parables that are given in there. They may have been given on different occasions, but anyway, Matthew quotes Christ as saying in Matthew 13:52, he asked them, you guys get this? You guys get all these parables and what they're pointing to? And they all answered in the affirmative, but I'm not sure they really did get it. But but basically, he said, then your assignment is, you call them scribes or teachers. You set the stories. You write these things down. That any scribe or householder, he called them, then basically what he was saying is any scribe or householder, steward, goes into his storehouse in his writing and teaching, presents things familiar. In other words, we don't throw the old out.
Right.
But also things fresh.
Yes.
That are associated with the familiar.
Yeah.
That are forward looking.
Yes.
And that's really what I sort of feel like I was inspired to do in connecting some of these dots, bringing science right up to mystery, because you can't prove a mystery empirically.
Right.
But you can look at the data that points to what's spoken of the mystery in the scriptures. You can bring the two of them and show their points of commonality and say, wow, this looks like it's where they intersect. This looks like what, if spirit is the substance of all form, then what is that substance?
Right.
And science has an answer for that.
Right.
Science has an answer for the substance of the the invisible substance of the implicate order that's everywhere.
And
It's
we're going to talk about this and get more in depth. Today for everybody, we're trying to set the foundation here for
Yes.
future more in-depth discussions. And Joe's book, believe me, when you read The Ambient Christ, you're going to see immediately that Joe's put obviously considerable years into writing this book, because you've got some great science in this, and we're going to talk about that science. So we're going to really get into the drill down. But before you start drilling down, you have to have an episode like this to introduce the subject, to let people know how you got to it, to understand that we at Presence are seeing from a theological end this same meeting at the pole with the science narratives, as you beautifully described there. One thing I'd like to do as we wrap it up here in this episode, I would like for you to talk a little bit about the term ambient, the ambient Christ, because your subtitle is especially notable when it talks about the inside story. So just so people can kind of know where we're headed here, because you're just like I have integral models, quadrants, and spirals, you're going to have some models that we're going to talk about from science. We're going to talk about those models and do comparative things. Mm-hmm. But before we roll out of here today, I'd like for you to say a few words about how you came to ambient as that title and the inside story.
Yes, I tried to find a word that did justice to the notion that God is everywhere, because in my early Christian experience, of course, thinking more empirically, how does he do it? What's the trick?
Right.
Okay. So I had to pick a word that expressed omnipresence, meaning, there's no place God is not. It's one of the properties of divinity. So knowing that and being able to show, or as best I can prove, that there's a seamless co-presence of God in creation. Now, that's not pantheism. That's, God is we're distinct from the invisible order or spirit, but we're not separate from.
Right.
So I wanted to pick a word that best expressed atmosphere, or, and the ambiance usually associated with light, mm-hmm. or sound, it gives the sense of atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And the subtitle came from the notion, the inside story. I mean, people are always looking for the inside story about something.
Yeah.
What's the real scoop here?
Right.
What are the underlying realities, that maybe people skim over? So inside story implies, and because divinity works in creation from the inside out.
Yes.
The innermost of us, center to periphery.
Yes.
And so, I'm describing and defining the invisible order, otherwise known as the implicate order.
Yeah. And
you can't get any more inside or central than in creation, in human spirits and souls, and in nature itself, than the interior of things, however invisible. So that's really where the title and subtitle came from.
Which once again is drawing a parallel with where quantum physics seems to be going. We'll talk about in future episodes, and that is, it's headed more toward, again, what we would, one of the terms you could use is formlessness, meaning that there's always something beyond for science, and it's going a specific direction. And you're already starting, when we start theologically or when we start with spirit, we're starting and we're coming the other way. We're coming, that's what they call involution, where there's this first state of spirit, and then Big Bang is the involution, and involution is where there's the pouring out that eventually ends up in form. Science starts with form in Newton and then moves into quantum and heads towards formless. So we're all on this same journey.
Yeah, where we're headed in putting these integral pieces together is that spirit, or God, is the substance of all form, and the substance of all form is invisible.
Yes, exactly.
We're going to be talking about what that invisible substance is.
That's right. Next episode, folks, tune in and roll up your sleeves, and maybe this will give you all an opportunity to order Joe's book, The Ambient Christ. We have a link to it in today's newsletter for those of you that are watching this because you got our newsletter. This is also going to be posted on our website. So for anybody that's watching this on the website, you can get in touch with us, info@presence.tv. If you have any questions about this or want to get in touch further with Joe, we'll have that information on the website. So if you can read the book ahead of time, this is the time to try to read some of the first chapters as you can. We're going to kind of take the first chapters and move along. Joe and I have been talking this through, kicking it around. We're thinking maybe 4 episodes here. So, okay, we're thinking we might get into that, but we're going to start with his key integral models and integral people. We're going to talk about Tesla and electric universe theory and all kind of good things when we get in here in the next episode. So Joe, once again, I'm so glad you're here to talk about science and spirituality. It's going to be a great series.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to future discussions.
Well, that will do it for us this time. Thanks everybody for joining in. We'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.